Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker, shills, desolate serfs, peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks, Ukrainians, YouTubers, you crazy Americans. I'm a useful idiot. Welcome. And today, obviously, I want to talk about the Ukraine again and take another look at the big picture. Where are we now? And to get to one of the main topics of discussion these days, the World War III scenario that seems so popular, whether Russia, Ukraine, or the United States will be involved in a war over the events that are unfolding in Ukraine. And the short answer is no. And the long answer is let's look at all the ingredients that we have in Ukraine right now and why there won't be a war. So first of all, one of the presumptions of this scenario is the idea that Putin is expansionary, that Russia is going to be an aggressive force outside its borders. And I just don't see that scenario. It wouldn't be smart for Putin and Russia. They've had a great coup with this Crimea grab, and things couldn't have gone better, really. And I think they have legitimate claims for that region, and they knew it. And they moved very quickly so that there wouldn't be time to react. There wouldn't be time for any complications. And we see the West doing that now as well. The IMF bailout is being fast-tracked now. So everybody's trying to consolidate, solidify their positions. And Russia is doing the same. The dust will settle, and the Crimea move will be accepted as it has to be. It's inevitable. And the idea that the Soviet Union is going to move into the Baltic states again, or anywhere else in that region, just seems a little far-fetched. And we also see that the dynamics militarily are also preclude any sort of military confrontation. And I want to clarify, too, that in an earlier video I did about the Ukraine, I erroneously stated figures for the Ukrainian military that were based on their military immediately after the Soviet breakup. And as everyone knows now, they had a huge nuclear stockpile, third largest in the world, and a 750,000-man army after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But since then, their army's down to 170,000, and of course they've given up their nuclear arsenal. So, like many watchers of this situation, we're learning more and more about Ukraine every day. And so we have a very mismatched military situation. The Russian military is modern and powerful and has a long history. The Ukrainian military now is seen a fair amount of neglect since the collapse of the Soviet Union. They haven't had the money to really invest in it. And we also have units now that are going to have dubious loyalties, depending on what kind of situations unfold. So we're going to see a culling going on in the military all over the Ukraine as people realign based on their affinities, whether it's Crimeans or pro-Russian Ukrainians, Russians or Ukrainians. And so that complicates the matter for Ukraine. There's just no real way they could mount any kind of serious military campaign. But I always don't want to rule that out, because we have sociopaths and psychopaths running most countries in the world, Ukraine certainly being no exception whatsoever, and anything could happen. But I really don't see a military confrontation happening. A lot of leaders posturing for their populations and their constituents who want their leaders to be tough guys when this sort of shit goes down. So anyway, and then it just doesn't make sense for Putin, as I said earlier, to make any moves further. The reacquisition of Crimea was a major coup, and I think now what we're seeing is a consolidation of the new government in Kiev. And one of the things they have to do is they're going to have to distance themselves from these right-wing groups and these neo-Nazi groups, because this could really unravel the revolution, so-called revolution, or Western-backed coup. And the dramatic event this last week was Muzychko, a major figure in the right-wing neo-Nazi movement in Ukraine, who has been a major figure in this operation, and he was murdered. Of course, the universal of resisting arrest is being used. Essentially, he was murdered, and one of the reasons we know that is because Muzychko himself posted a video, I think about a week ago, saying that he was probably going to be killed by the opposition leaders in Kiev. And Muzychko was not a good man. I've seen a lot of videos of his behavior, and he is exactly what you would expect from a nationalist, anti-Semitic neo-Nazi. And these groups do exist in Ukraine, and that's another interesting factor about this that we see. We see the United States basically funding and backing opposition groups like Al-Qaeda in Syria, and we see the same United States funding these neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine. And it makes perfect sense. You need thugs to go out and challenge governments, because citizens aren't necessarily going to be motivated. But once you get the thugs out there and get some numbers, then it becomes a popular uprising, and there's chances are a lot of people who have their hopes pinned on some kind of new democracy movement that will come out of the shadows and meld with these groups. But you need thugs, and in Ukraine, that's what we saw in a lot of these protests. A lot of these right-wing neo-Nazi groups, they're willing to take the police head on, and that's what needed to happen to have this coup happen in the Ukraine. So it's just interesting to see what kind of proxies the United States gets involved with, whether it's Syria or the Ukraine. And so now we see the Kiev government is going to distance itself from these right-wing groups, and now they have been useful idiots. And one pundit I saw on a show recently correctly pointed out the similarity between that and the rise of Hitler, who had the brown shirt thugs who went out and did the dirty work, but once he rose to power, he had to assimilate them back into the herd and get rid of the leadership. And now that the right-wing groups have served their purpose as useful idiots, then now we will see the government Kiev consolidate power and try to neutralize these right-wing groups, and we might see more of these assassinations. But part of the problem, though, of course, we could see a lot of violence unfold in Ukraine if these right-wing groups go through on their promise to retaliate for this assassination and any further violence. And, of course, then who knows what will unravel from there. And then kind of like we see in a lot of these other scenarios as well, like Iraq, we have all these militias all over the Ukraine now, and both community protection groups, regional groups, and then of course the political groups, and then the organized groups, and pro-Russians and Ukrainians and Crimeans and everyone else. So what's the end game? What's the end game in Ukraine? Well, one of my theories is that just like all the other countries that have been destabilized, does the United States want a failed state in Ukraine for now? It would almost seem so. We're stepping in there to load them up with debt, and right when the country is very fragile from this so-called post-revolutionary period, they're going to be subjected to brutal austerity, and that does not bode well for a new struggling government. We've seen it time after time, and this could also be a purposeful quagmire. The United States can create a more or less failed state in Ukraine, make them debt slaves, and then also create a disruptive economic quagmire for Russian interests there, because there's still a lot of people in Russia and Ukraine that commute back and forth to work, and there's still a huge amount of Russian investment and a lot of economic entanglements. And this would be a really excellent way to undermine Russia's position by creating this failed state in their backyard, the noted Ukrainian breadbasket of Europe. And so if anybody has any thoughts on that idea of the U.S. wanting a failed state there, that seems to be the way it's lining up. But I also wanted to point out very interesting fact that in Brzezinski's book of the Grand Chessboard, and this was published 20 years ago now, Brzezinski, who of course is one of the players, an insider's insider, and he's talked about this whole scenario in Ukraine and knew of its importance and knew what piece it plays. And I'm not really going to go into too much detail other than say that this is unfolded pretty much the way Brzezinski envisioned and for the reasons that he said it would happen. And it's having the effects that he also predicted. So I will attach the discussion with Brzezinski below and a reference to that, the article. And so there we have what's going on now. And like any situation like we're seeing in Ukraine, it's unpredictable. So I will be doing further updates if anything dramatic continues to unfold there, which is certainly not hard to rule out. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.